In the cold silence of an underground parking garage, a powerful man stopped in his tracks. A faint sniffle echoed through the shadows, and there, hidden behind a concrete pillar, was a little girl no older than 6. Her shoes were gone, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and her trembling voice whispered, "Please don't tell them I'm here." In that moment, a millionaire CEO realized his wealth could not shield him from the truth about to unfold. He had built empires, signed contracts worth billions, but nothing prepared him for the weight of one frightened child. What began as chance soon unraveled into a story of survival, betrayal, and redemption. Stay with us as we follow a journey that proves sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest echoes. And if stories like this move you, subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories and never miss the ones that matter most. The underground garage beneath Whitaker Tower had always been a place of quiet transition, a concrete halfway world where engines hummed low and footsteps echoed briefly before fading into the night above. On most evenings, it was filled with the polished noise of wealth, valets laughing lightly as they parked sleek cars, the clicking of designer heels, the distant growl of an expensive engine fading into the dark. But tonight was different. Tonight, silence hung like a curtain, heavy and unsettling, disturbed only by the faint flicker of a motion sensor light as it buzzed to life over an empty corner. James Whitaker parked his Bentley slowly, the engine purring into stillness before he stepped out. His Italian shoes clicked against the cement, and the long navy overcoat he wore seemed too heavy for his tired shoulders. In one hand he carried his phone, screen glowing with reminders of the life he had built and the endless responsibilities tied to it. In the other, a briefcase filled with documents, none of which could ease the fatigue settled deep in his bones. His tie, loosened just enough to suggest weariness, framed a face that had forgotten what rest truly felt like. There were messages waiting for him, dozens from board members, investors, advisors. His sister had sent him a video of her daughter's 7th birthday party, a cupcake lit with candles, tiny hands clapping in excitement. James deleted it before he could hear her ask where he was. It was easier that way. It was always easier to silence the reminders of a life he had long abandoned for boardrooms and headlines. He started toward the elevator, his eyes fixed on the polished steel doors at the far end. That was when he heard it. A sound so soft it almost vanished into the stillness, a faint shuffle followed by a quick, breathless sniffle. He froze. A chill ran down his spine, awakening reflexes he had carried since the days he wore a uniform in Afghanistan. His hand instinctively rose to his neck, pressing against the spot where old tension always returned when danger lingered unseen. Slowly, carefully, James turned his head, scanning the shadowed edges of the garage. His footsteps softened as he approached a concrete pillar near the emergency exit, every movement cautious. When he rounded the corner, his breath caught. There, crouched low against the wall, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 6 years old. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around them as if she could make herself vanish into the cold cement. She wore no shoes, only socks worn thin at the soles. Her dress, once printed with cartoon animals, was faded and frayed from too many washes. Her hair fell in tangled strands around a pale face, and on one cheek a bruise bloomed purple. Around her wrist clung a peeling red sticker, its edges curled as though it had been there too long. James knelt slowly, careful not to frighten her. "Hey," he said softly, voice stripped of the authority it carried in every meeting. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched but did not run. She tilted her chin deeper into her knees and whispered, "Please don't tell them I'm here." Her words struck harder than any accusation he had ever faced across a conference table. His throat tightened. "I won't," he promised. "I swear." He set the briefcase down carefully and shrugged off his coat, draping it gently across her small shoulders. She did not resist. "What's your name?" he asked. At first there was only silence. Then after a moment her lips moved. "Leela," she whispered, though it sounded uncertain, like she wasn't sure she should even be saying it aloud. James offered a faint smile. "Hi Leela, I'm James, you're safe now." For a brief moment her eyes lifted to his, wide and rimmed with red. There was something haunting in them, an exhaustion far too old for a child's face. Then she spoke again, her voice trembling. "The last man said I'd forget too, like Mommy did." The words hung between them, heavy, confusing, terrifying in their implication. James wanted to ask what she meant, but she curled tighter into herself, hiding beneath the coat. He glanced around, torn between calling security or the police, but something in the way she clutched at the fabric told him that leaving her in anyone else's hands would be a mistake. James lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her head tucking against his chest like a fragile bird folding in its wings. As he carried her through the marble lobby of Whitaker Tower, the concierge rose in surprise. "Sir, should I call someone?" "No," James replied firmly, not slowing his steps. "I've got it." On the 23rd floor, inside the executive lounge, he laid her on a velvet couch near the window. The city lights sparkled beyond the glass, cold and distant, but inside the room everything felt quieter. Leela curled into the oversized coat, silent, watchful. James loosened his tie, set his phone face down on the table, and simply sat across from her. For the first time in years, he allowed his world to stand still. He should have left it to the proper authorities. He told himself that again and again. He was a CEO, not a rescuer. He built corporations, not families. Yet, as the minutes stretched into an hour, James realized he could not walk away. The way she gripped the edge of his coat with white knuckles, the way her eyes darted to the door as though expecting it to open at any moment, it all tethered him to her. When she finally whispered, "Don't make me go back," James knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident, no passing encounter. This was the moment his life was being rewritten, and there would be no turning back. The night in the executive lounge stretched long and uneasy. James sat across from the little girl, her small frame swallowed in his navy coat. The city glittered behind the tall glass windows, but for once he felt no pride in the skyline that had once been his empire. He leaned back, his phone buzzing insistently on the table, each vibration pulling him toward the familiar world of deals and obligations. Yet his gaze kept returning to her, to the fragile outline of a child who seemed too quiet, too contained, as though silence had been her only defense for far too long. He reached for the water in the minibar, twisting the cap and setting it gently on the table beside her. "You must be thirsty," he said softly. She glanced at it, then back to the window, her hands clutching the fabric of his coat tighter. She did not move. He added a granola bar beside it, the smallest offering he could think of, but still she refused to touch it. Minutes passed before her voice came again, thin as paper. "Mom sleeps a lot." James leaned forward, careful not to startle her. "Where is she?" The girl did not answer. She tugged at the peeling sticker on her wrist instead, eyes fixed on the red patch like it carried all the answers she did not want to speak aloud. "Who gave that to you?" James asked gently. Her reply was almost inaudible. "Greg, he says it helps." Something in James's stomach turned. He had heard that name before, though not from her lips. Gregory Knox, a man once known in the pharmaceutical circles for chasing ideas too volatile for public release, had vanished years ago under the shadow of an internal investigation. James thought he had been buried by the system. Now, sitting across from a trembling child, the name resurfaced with the weight of something monstrous. The next day, James carried the girl, Leia, as she called herself, into his car. He buckled her carefully in the backseat, her small hands gripping a stuffed bunny he had bought hurriedly from a nearby shop. She stared out the window in silence, her reflection pale against the winter streets of Boulder. The address he followed came from the hospital band still looped around her wrist, faded but legible. When he arrived, his chest tightened. The building was no home, not really. It looked like a forgotten motel, half converted into living spaces that smelled of mildew and neglect. Rust streaked the gutters, windows rattled with broken seals, and the stairwell reeked of damp plaster. Leia walked ahead without hesitation, her small steps steady, as though she had done it countless times before. At the top of the narrow stairs, she paused in front of a green door. She did not knock. She simply turned the handle and walked inside. The stench hit James immediately, rotting food, stale sweat, and something sharper, chemical, like burnt plastic fused into the air itself. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering lamp that cast shadows long and twisted against peeling wallpaper. On a thin mattress pushed to the wall lay a woman. She looked too young to be so worn, her hair tangled, skin gray around the lips. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath a struggle. James froze when he saw the stickers on her arms, identical red patches to the one Leia wore. Some had left angry welts as though the skin itself had fought against them. "Mommy," Leia whispered, dropping to her knees beside the bed. She touched the woman's arm gently, but the woman did not stir. James approached, kneeling to press his fingers against her wrist. A faint pulse. Barely. He scanned the room quickly. No medicine bottles, no fresh food, just a counter littered with old takeout containers and a plastic bag marked with something chilling. NBX-42. Experimental use only, not for distribution. His breath caught. He had seen the acronym before, buried in old R&D files from his own company, TEXA Pharmaceuticals. The compound had been flagged years ago for causing neurological damage during trials. It should have been destroyed. Yet here it was, in vacuum-sealed patches wrapped in sterile packaging. His phone was in his hand before he realized it. He called emergency services, his voice clipped, efficient, the same tone he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, wheeling the unconscious woman, Isabel, into the ambulance. Leia clutched James's sleeve, panic flooding her wide eyes. "They will take me away too, won't they?" James crouched low, his voice steady but soft. "No one is taking you away, not this time." She hesitated, then slipped her small hand into his, holding tight as though she could anchor herself to him. At St. Albans Hospital, Isabel was transferred under an alias to protect her from the attention James knew would follow. Machines blinked beside her bed, charting fragile progress. Doctors were cautious but uncertain. They did not know what the patches had done to her nervous system, only that the damage was severe. James stood at the glass, watching her chest rise and fall, and felt something he had not felt in years, guilt that reached deeper than lost contracts or missed deadlines. He had built an empire on the promise of healing, but somewhere along the way, he had allowed ambition to blind him to the harm hidden beneath the surface. In the room next door, Leia sat curled on a hospital bed, Oscar Bunny in her lap, staring at nothing. Nurses had tried cartoons, juice boxes, distractions, but her silence remained. James entered quietly, carrying a small paper bag. From it, he pulled a plush rabbit identical to the one from the storybook his sister once read to him as a child. He placed it on her lap. "He keeps secrets," James said softly, "so you do not have to carry them all alone." She touched the toy briefly, but her eyes stayed distant. James lingered by the door, whispering, "I am not going anywhere." Later that night, he sat outside her room, scrolling through old trial archives, his jaw tightening with every discovery. NBX-42 had been halted years ago after reports of hallucinations and memory disruptions in minors. Yet someone had revived it, someone with power, and the name that kept reappearing, the ghost behind every line of correspondence, was Gregory Knox. The realization came with a fresh wave of fury. He was not just looking at a child in need. He was staring into the consequences of a betrayal buried in the very foundations of his empire. And for the first time in a long time, James knew this was no problem he could delegate or erase with money. This was personal. James had spent his life solving problems with contracts, signatures, and sealed agreements. Yet nothing in his decades of work prepared him for the sight of a child trembling in a hospital bed while machines tracked her every breath. Leia had grown weaker in the days that followed her mother's admission. At first, she sipped cocoa he had carefully prepared, even whispered a few words. But soon the fatigue deepened, her small hands grew cold, and her voice faded until only silence remained. One evening, as James studied documents recovered from old TEXA servers, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. It was short, sharp, and dangerous. "You are not supposed to look into NBX. Drop it or she disappears too." He stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Instead of fear, fury rose in him. He had spent years ignoring the shadows cast by his industry, but now those shadows had a name and a target. He deleted the message and walked straight to Leia's room. When he opened the door, she looked up from the book he had left beside her bed. Her eyes, usually guarded, softened slightly. "You came back," she murmured. James sat beside her, his chest tightening. "Of course I did." For the first time, something shifted between them. It was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet thread, fragile but real, pulling him closer to a child who had already begun to redefine his world. But the fragile piece shattered without warning. In the middle of the night, alarms blared in room 408. James sprinted down the corridor, his pulse racing. Nurses rushed around Leia's bed, her small body convulsing, monitors spiking and crashing in jagged rhythms. James tried to push forward, but a doctor held him back. "She is in acute neurological crisis," he said. James stood frozen in the doorway, watching the life slip from her frame. His fists clenched, helplessness pressing down like iron. Then Dr. Sienna Lee appeared, summoned by his desperate call. She examined Leia's blood under harsh laboratory lights and pointed at the glowing crystalline threads within her red cells. "This is not a virus," she whispered. "It is synthetic, a parasite feeding on her neural signals." Her words pierced him. "How long has it been there?" "Too long," she replied grimly. "Weeks, maybe months. If we attack it directly, we risk permanent damage. If we do nothing, it will shut her system down completely." James's voice was raw. "Then what do we do?" Sienna hesitated. "There may be one possibility. Years ago, you participated in a military trial, did you not? The V92 vaccine." James nodded slowly. He remembered the long nights, the unexplained fevers, the anomalies that had marked his blood ever since. "If your body carries residual markers," she said, "we may be able to use your plasma to synthesize a recombinant serum, something strong enough to bond to the parasite and shut it down without destroying her neurons." The risk was obvious, but James did not hesitate. "Do it." Within minutes, he was lying on a gurney, tube siphoning blood into a filtration machine that glowed with cold blue light. His veins ached, but he barely noticed. Beyond the glass, Leia lay motionless, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Sienna worked quickly, separating his plasma, isolating anomalies, feeding them into the synthesis system. James stared at the ceiling, forcing himself to remain calm, though every second felt like an eternity. He whispered once to no one in particular, "She called me Daddy." Sienna looked up, her eyes softening. Maybe it was not a question. At last the serum shimmered in a vial, faintly iridescent, like captured light. Sienna carried it into Leia's room, her hands steady despite the weight of what it meant. The injection slid into the IV line, and then all they could do was wait. 10 seconds, 20, alarms screamed, monitors plummeted. "She is crashing," a nurse cried. James slammed his hand against the glass. "Do something." Sienna's voice cut through the panic. "Wait." For a moment it seemed impossible. Then slowly a rhythm returned. Beeps steadied. Her chest lifted, then fell in fragile balance. James pressed his forehead against the glass, tears slipping silently. She was still here. Across the hall, Isabel stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for the first time in weeks. Her lips cracked, her voice faint, but her words clear. "Where is my baby?" The following morning, the hospital was quieter than usual. Snow fell beyond the windows, muting the city's noise. Leia slept peacefully, her color returning, her tiny hand curling instinctively when James touched her palm. Isabel sat upright, her memory patchy but her will strong. When James entered her room, she looked at him, not with suspicion but with a kind of fragile gratitude. "You stayed," she said simply. James nodded. "She asked me not to leave." Days passed in strange rhythm. James stopped attending board meetings, ignored calls from executives, and focused instead on uncovering everything hidden behind NBX. Files revealed more than he had feared. Children selected for their trauma backgrounds, their pain twisted into an excuse for experimentation. Gregory Knox's name appeared again and again, not as a ghost, but as an architect of cruelty. The anger in James thickened with each discovery. He met with federal investigators, placing evidence into their hands: stolen patches, lab reports, surveillance footage of Knox walking hospital halls with a stolen badge. The agents promised action, but James knew promises were brittle. He could not rely solely on institutions that had already failed children like Leah. At the same time, something gentler was unfolding. In room 408, Leah began to speak again. Not much, just fragments. A whispered thank you when he brought her cocoa, a quiet smile when she handed him a butterscotch candy she had kept hidden in her pocket. He realized then that trust did not arrive in declarations. It came in tiny offerings, in the smallest gestures. One afternoon she gave him a drawing, 3 figures beneath a crooked heart. A woman with brown hair, a little girl in a red dress, and a tall man with blue eyes. James stared at it, his throat tight. "You added me," he said softly. She nodded. "You remember, not like Mommy, you remember." He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his briefcase, more valuable than any contract it had ever carried. Later that night, as he sat alone, James thought of the choices that had led him here. He had once believed power came from money, from influence, from controlling outcomes before they unfolded. But now, looking back, he understood that real power was something quieter. It was staying when leaving was easier. It was choosing to be present, even when it hurt. And as he glanced at the faint light beneath Leah's hospital door, James knew he had already chosen. There are moments in life when the noise of the world grows so loud that it drowns out everything else. James Whittaker once lived in that noise: stock updates, endless meetings, the constant rhythm of ambition and power. Yet one quiet night in an underground garage, a faint sniffle cut through it all, and in that fragile sound, his entire world shifted. The story of Leah is not just about a child found in the shadows. It is about the resilience of a little girl who had every reason to give up but still held on. It is about a mother who became a victim of a system that should have protected her, but instead exploited her. And it is about a man who thought he had nothing left to give, only to discover that love can be the most powerful act of courage. James did not plan to become a protector. He did not imagine himself holding a child's hand through hospital corridors or sacrificing his own blood to keep her alive. But sometimes life does not ask what we are ready for. It simply places us where we are needed most. And when that moment arrives, what we choose to do defines everything that follows. For Leah, survival was never guaranteed. The drugs coursing through her system threatened to erase not only her health but also her childhood. Yet with every obstacle, James stood closer, not because he was a hero, but because he finally understood what it meant to show up for someone who had no one else. Love is not about grand gestures. It is about staying when it would be easier to walk away. And when Leah pressed a candy into his palm or drew his figure into her family sketch, it was more than a child's gift. It was trust. It was healing taking shape in the simplest ways. It was proof that broken bonds can be rebuilt, and that even after years of mistakes, it is never too late to begin again. This story is more than fiction. It is a reminder that behind every statistic, every headline, there are real lives, fragile, precious, and worth protecting. It reminds us that the wealth of the world cannot compare to the quiet power of compassion. It reminds us that redemption is always possible, and that family is not only defined by blood, but by the choices we make to stand with one another. If you are listening now, let this be more than just another story you hear and forget. Let it be a seed of hope, a call to action. Let it remind you that kindness has the power to change the course of a life. And if these stories stir your heart, if they remind you of the truths we sometimes forget in the rush of our days, then we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories, where every tale is a chance to feel, to heal, and to remember that even in the darkest places, love can still find a way.